In the heart of Salem stood an old, looming building, the infamous Salem Witch Museum. Tourists flocked year-round, eager to step inside and relive the horrors of the witch trials that once stained the town with blood and fear. Within its darkened halls, visitors found relics from Salem's sinister past. Broken nooses that had once ended lives, charred remnants of torches used to light execution pyres, and eerie wax figures representing the accused women whose cries of innocence had gone unheard. It was a macabre spectacle, a shrine to the hysteria that had consumed the town centuries ago. But the building was more than just a museum. It was a graveyard for spirits long forgotten, and those spirits were far from resting. Richard Black, the museum's owner, viewed it in a completely different light. To him, it was neither a place of reverence nor reflection. It was simply a business. He had no interest in Salem's tragic history or the tormented souls of the women who had suffered and died. To Richard, the Salem Witch Museum was nothing more than a cash machine. For over 2 decades, he managed the museum from a distance, with cold efficiency, rarely visiting in person. When he did, he expertly ignored the eerie whispers that seemed to trail him through the darkened corridors late at night. Unsettling feelings and shifting shadows meant nothing to him. What mattered was the constant flow of tourists and their money. In late October, Richard decided to sell his other investments and devote more attention to the museum. It had become his most profitable venture, and he planned to expand the exhibits to attract even more visitors. He paid no mind to the idea of spirits lurking within the walls, but the spirits had been paying attention to him. It began with faint whispers. Late at night, after locking up, Richard would hear noises he couldn't explain. At first, it was barely audible, just a faint murmur, like the wind pushing through the old walls. He dismissed it as the building settling, nothing more. But soon the noises became clearer. Voices. Women's voices. They were soft at first, broken and trembling as if coming from far away. Sometimes they wept, their cries echoing through the museum long after the last tourist had left. Other times they whispered his name in tones full of bitterness and pain, but always the voices were there. Richard brushed it off, telling himself it was his imagination or perhaps the wind passing through the cracks of the old building. After all, it was an ancient place, full of creaks and groans. Yet the voices persisted, following him as he moved through the museum after hours. It became harder to ignore. Soon, the atmosphere of the museum itself began to change. The air, always musty and thick with the scent of old wood and forgotten history, became colder. Visitors even started commenting on it, their breath misting as if winter had seeped into the walls. Shadows shifted in strange ways, crawling up the walls and lingering far longer than they should have. Richard found himself glancing over his shoulder more often, feeling watched, though he was always alone. Then came the dreams. Every night he found himself wandering through the dark fields of old Salem in his sleep, surrounded by ghostly figures. The women were twisted in agony, their faces gaunt, their bodies frail and contorted. Some had ropes hanging from their necks, the angry red marks visible against their pale skin. Others were burned, their flesh blackened and raw from the flames that had consumed them. They said nothing at first, only watched him with hollow eyes, their mouths open in silent screams. Each night, the dreams grew more vivid, more terrifying. The figures came closer, their faces inches from his, their breath cold and foul against his skin. He could hear the crackling of fire behind them, the faint smell of burning wood and flesh filling the air. They whispered in low voices, their words a cacophony of pain and suffering. "You profit from our pain," they hissed. "You mock our suffering." He would wake drenched in sweat, his heart racing, unable to shake the lingering sense of dread. He told himself they were just dreams, nothing more than his mind playing tricks on him. But the women from his nightmares began to bleed into his waking hours. He would catch glimpses of them in the glass display cases, their pale faces watching him from behind the reflections. Sometimes he saw them out of the corner of his eye, shadowy figures standing at the end of the hallway, disappearing when he turned to face them. Worse still were the sensations. Footsteps echoed through the halls when he knew the museum was empty. The air would suddenly turn icy, and Richard would feel a cold, bony hand brush the back of his neck, sending shivers down his spine. But when he turned, there was never anyone there. As the hauntings intensified, Richard's denial began to crumble. He was a man of logic, but logic offered no explanations for what was happening. He wanted answers, relief from the growing terror that stalked his every move. He hired mystics who gave him charms and candles and whispered prayers in hushed tones, but none of it worked. If anything, the activity in the museum grew worse. The spirits, once content to whisper and haunt the shadows, were now making themselves known. They slammed doors with enough force to rattle the walls, shattered glass display cases, and threw objects from the shelves as if mocking the trivial souvenirs that had become their legacy. The wax figures of the witches, made to resemble their agony and torment, were often found knocked over, their faces twisted into grotesque shapes. It was as if the spirits were trying to send a message through the very figures created to memorialize their suffering. One night, as Richard was closing up after a particularly unnerving day, something shoved him hard. The force was invisible, but powerful enough to send him tumbling down the museum's grand staircase. He crashed onto the cold marble floor, his leg bent at an awkward angle, his ribs throbbing with pain. His body was bruised and battered, but it was his mind that had taken the deepest wound. Lying on the floor, gasping for breath, Richard realized something he had been too stubborn to admit. The spirits didn't just want to scare him. They wanted him gone, and they wouldn't stop until they had their revenge. The next morning, bruised and limping, Richard made a decision. He would sell the museum. He couldn't live like this anymore. The museum, once his greatest asset, had become a prison, haunted by the spirits of women who had suffered unimaginable pain. And as long as he continued to profit from that pain, they would never leave him in peace. The Salem Witch Museum went up for sale within days, but weeks passed with no serious offers. Word of the hauntings had spread throughout the town, and no one was eager to take on the museum's dark legacy. The locals whispered about Richard's torment, and though some were skeptical, many believed the stories. Everyone knew better than to meddle with the angry dead. That was until Evelyn Mercer appeared. Evelyn was a young woman, no more than 25, with jet black hair and a lifelong obsession with the occult. She had studied witchcraft from a young age, collecting books, crystals, and symbols of protection. To her, the museum was not something to fear. It was an opportunity. She had always wanted to own a place steeped in supernatural energy, and the Salem Witch Museum seemed like the perfect fit. She dismissed Richard's warnings as mere superstition, convinced that she could handle whatever spirits lingered there. When Evelyn took over, she immediately set about trying to transform the museum into something new. She wanted to honor the women who had died, to show respect where Richard had shown only greed. She brought in candles, incense, and protective charms, trying to cleanse the space of its dark energy. But the moment she stepped into the museum as its new owner, she felt it. The shift. The air was thick with resentment, suffocating and cold. Still, Evelyn pressed on, believing that she could soothe the restless spirits. But they would not be soothed. The candles she lit flickered violently, casting twisted shadows on the walls. The crystals she placed around the museum cracked, and her prized books on witchcraft flew off the shelves, their pages opening to dark spells she had never encountered before. Each night, she was visited by the same nightmares that had haunted Richard, visions of the women who had died, their bodies broken and burned, their eyes filled with anger. During one seance, the spirits made their intentions clear. The room went dark, and the air turned so cold that frost formed on the windows. The participants huddled together in fear, but Evelyn, in her arrogance, pressed on. "Spirits of Salem, show yourselves," she called out. And they did. A deafening wail filled the room, rattling the walls. Objects flew through the air, books, candles, relics, crashing to the floor in a frenzy. The table shook violently, and the wax figures toppled to the ground, shattering into pieces. Evelyn screamed as the temperature dropped further, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Then she felt it. Cold fingers around her throat, lifting her off the ground. "You are no different," the voices whispered, their tone filled with centuries of bitterness. "You will suffer as we have suffered." With a violent force, Evelyn was thrown across the room. The seance ended in chaos, the participants fleeing in terror, leaving Evelyn behind, bruised and trembling. By morning, she was gone, fleeing Salem, leaving behind her books, her crystals, and her dreams of owning the museum. The Salem Witch Museum now stands abandoned, its windows boarded up, its doors locked tight. No one dares to enter. The spirits of the women, their pain and anger unresolved,